Welcome to week 10 of the lecture International Trade. In this lecture today, we are going to take a look at the gravity equation, border tax, COVID-19, and we're going to draw some conclusions from that. Why are we going to discuss the gravity equation? Well, the gravity equation is the workforce, the workhorse, not the workforce. It's a workhorse of international trade empirics. So every time you want to investigate empirically, econometrically, some relationships in international trade, you generally resort to the gravity equation. That's why it's important to know what it is. The environment is something that is present in every country, and climate change, as you know, is a phenomenon affecting every country without any exception. So it's very important for the world as a whole, for all developing and for all developed countries, to take this challenge very seriously. Coming down to trade, we can see that countries that are doing a lot to reduce their emissions, they don't want to import goods that are being produced with a lot of emissions. And for this reason, they want to avoid leakages, and they are introducing border taxes on goods intensive in CO2 emissions. This is a topic that we need to discuss. Finally, the world has been struggling with a very dangerous virus since the end of 2019, and we're still struggling today in 2021. So we need to have a closer look. What happened? How did countries react to this virus, and what were the consequences for international trade? The gravity equation explains the trade between two or more countries. In its simplest form, it relates to the bilateral trade between two countries, and the hypothesis of this equation is that bilateral trade is directly proportional to the product of the country's GDPs. So the idea is that the larger a country is, yes, the more trade this country will have with other countries, other large countries, yes. So large countries have a lot of things to trade with each other, while smaller countries, of course, have a smaller spectrum of production. Yes, a small country cannot produce all goods, is obliged to engage in trade in order to satisfy the demands of consumers and producers and the government. So larger countries have a broader spectrum of goods and services, and so the potential for more trade is there. The importance of a country's economic size in explaining trade patterns was first recognized by the Dutch economist Jan Tinbergen back in the last century in 1962. Jan Tinbergen was awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics for his work. He proposed that the volume of trade between countries should be similar to the force of gravity between physical objects. Yes, so referring to Newton's universal law of gravitation. According to Newton, as you might know, the force of gravity, higher case F between two objects, two physical objects, is equal to a gravitational constant and the product, the multiplication of the masses of two objects, 1 and 2, divided by the distance between the two objects, the squared distance between both objects. So the larger the objects are, the closer they are to each other, the greater is the force of gravity between them. Something very similar happens in economics. Applying Newton's formula to economics looks like this. On the left-hand side of the equation, we have exports or imports or the sum of both, exports plus imports. On the right-hand side, we have a constant, which of course is different from country to country. And we have the product of both GDPs. And in the denominator, we have the distance between both countries elevated to the power of rho, the Greek symbol rho. Why is this so? Well, we don't know what rho is between two countries. It's very different from physics. Yes, we don't have a clear constant, yes, that applies to all countries, and we don't have a power here, an exponent that will apply to all countries. So we have to estimate the rho. So since Tinbergen came up with his research, a number of economists have tried to follow, and we know now that this equation, this approach works very, very well to explain trade internationally between countries, but also to explain trade between regions, yes, for example, within one country, or explaining trade in a certain region, let's say in the African continent or in Asia or in Latin America or in Europe, yes. So you can use it for different purposes. And you can also use it within a country, for example, to study the trade between two provinces of South Africa. Yes, so this would be also possible using the gravity equation. Well, what does this equation look like? We just take the natural logs of the formula we just saw. And so on the left-hand side, we have exports or imports or exports plus imports. This is the trade between country I and country J. This is a constant which we need to estimate. And here we have the two GDPs. That's a higher case Y of country I and higher case Y of country J. And of course, we take the natural logarithms of both. And the third important variable here is the distance, right, between I and G. And as you can see here, rho, yes, the exponent is a coefficient that we can estimate if we estimate the whole equation. Finally, as always in econometrics, we have a stochastic disturbance term. Generally, when you read papers in which this gravity equation has been used, you find the variables that you see here, in addition to other variables that might be important for the particular countries that you are studying. For example, there geographic location, demography, culture, language spoken, etc. Yes, so you can imagine there is a vector of other variables that may be included into this equation. Let's now turn to border tax and trade. The border CO2 tax is something that has been coming up over the last 10 years. There is also very highly developed research in this area, but of course we need more research as always, particularly relating to developing countries. So many countries have already started, also not only developed countries but also developing countries have started reducing CO2 emissions and very much interested in creating disincentives for firms from their countries to move to other countries with weaker regulations and to export the goods from there back to the countries of origin. And of course, they want to discourage imports from countries where CO2 regulations are very weak and where most production still takes place under high levels of CO2 emissions. Um, Now, what is the economic impact of a border tax, for border CO2 tax? Um, if you might recall that we have studied the effect of a tariff on imports, yes, under both perfect competition and imperfect competition. Well, exactly the same analysis applies to a border tax, a border CO2 tax. For example, under perfect competition, the tax, just like a tariff, increases the price of the imported good in the domestic market. Well, if a good becomes dearer in the domestic market, then this reduces consumer surplus and at the same time increases producer surplus if the good is also produced in the domestic market and generates revenue for the government. Thus, what we see here is an income transfer from consumers to producers and the government because of the tax and because of tariffs too, right? So if you take a look at the prescribed reading, chapter 5 for perfect competition and chapter 10 for imperfect competition, there you will see the analysis of what is the impact of a tariff on a country's welfare. Um, we are here interested not, yes, in the algebraic derivation. We are interested just in the figures, yes, where you have supply curves, demand curves, yes, and have the plane of good one and good two, and that's all what we need. Or you have a plane where you have the price and the quantity, yes. But this is all we need to know in this course. We are not very much interested in the exact and detailed derivation, algebraic derivation of these issues. Let's switch now to the virus. Well, the virus surprised the world economy towards late 2019. There's still our investigations going on where this virus came from. The first incidence was reported from China, from a city called Wuhan, and so the idea is that possibly this virus originated in China, but still we don't know exactly if it has originated in one of the wet markets, yes, where the virus might have jumped, yes, from an animal, from a wild animal to a human, or if it just escaped from a laboratory. So we don't know that. And but we can say that China was the first country to experience the virus. Well, this virus spread a lot because China, as you know, through supply chains, is very well networked, yes, with other countries, with many other countries. So there are a number of people traveling, or there were, yes, before the pandemic, between China and many other countries. And of course, these people who contracted the virus, yes, they brought it home and, well, created the conditions for the pandemic to spread in many countries. And as we know today, uh, there shouldn't be any country without the virus. Maybe some of the islands, yes, but it's very uncommon. So this virus has spread. How did countries react to the pandemic? Well, most of them, including South Africa, including Germany, reacted by closing the borders, by interrupting tourism, by interrupting business travel, and by closing down firms producing the non-essential goods and personal services. So the government only wanted to keep markets open so that people could buy foods and essential goods, but that was all. Well, even if measures like this are transitory, yes, just for some months, world production and with it world trade suffer a very serious interruption in 2020 and 2021. And I think I showed you some curves about foreign trade, about world trade in the first lecture. Please take a look at the readings for the first lecture where I presented some slides from the World Trade Organization. Some countries already began to recover in 2021, but most countries are very likely to experience an upswing in 2022 or in 2023. So what is the role of economic policy in such a situation? Well, of course, the first measure is to protect the health of the citizens. Yes, this is the first measure. So that is why closing down, the lockdown was a good thing just to avoid the virus from spreading as long as you don't have a vaccine for a great majority of the population. Once the vaccine is there and can be distributed, yes, then of course the need for a lockdown disappears. Yes, a lockdown. We must also say the difference between China and a country like South Africa or Germany is that China is not a democracy and South Africa and Germany are democracies, so that in a lockdown you are interfering with human rights. And of course you should only do that as long as it is really necessary, and after that immediately give back the freedom to the citizens. So the first measure is to protect the health of the citizens, and after this has been successful, try to get enough vaccines so that everybody can be vaccinated. This is very, very important. After that, it's time to open up the economy again, to let tourism flow in and to let business travelers do their work. And of course, non-essential firms should also be allowed to start producing again. So these are the issues that are important here. And in most countries, that is the path that economic policy has chosen. During the pandemic, many international supply chains broke down. And this is normal because production was stopped. And so, of course, then you cannot supply anymore. And for example, if production in China was stopped, and China is a central country, as far as supply chains are concerned, then of course this has an impact on the supply chains, or an impact on the supply of many goods to many countries. Yes, so if these goods are not supplied anymore, then something breaks down. Now, some countries have tried to look for substitutes for the broken supply chains. So they started producing themselves the goods that they imported from other countries, or they started to look for new suppliers in other countries. Yes. So the supply chain, the structure of supply chain is changing very fast. Now, what can countries do in order to recover as soon as possible? Well, tariff barriers should be reduced as much as possible to make trade happen. And it's very necessary to understand that the pandemic is not a time for protection or beggar thy neighbor policies, protecting the domestic economy at the expense of other countries, and particularly of countries reducing trade barriers. So we need to keep the markets open and keep trade flowing. Some of the firms in countries that relied heavily on offshoring, yes, they have started to switch to nearshoring. Yes. And nearshoring is something that on a transitory basis could be helpful, yes, but it's not necessarily the best choice in the long run. So supply chains have to be constructed in a new way. They should be constructed like a portfolio, like an investment portfolio where you have shares and bonds. Yes. So that in a portfolio you take in shares and bonds to diversify the risk. So you don't stick to one share of one company or to two shares. Yes, you try to take a lot, and that applies also to bonds in order to diversify away the risk that is involved in holding one share or one bond. Applied to supply chains, the issue is the risk, to minimize the risk of relying only on one supplier. Yes, never put all eggs in one basket. Everybody knows that. So that is why if we have one supplier, we should immediately identify a second and a third supplier in case the first supplier locks down. Let me conclude. The gravity equation is the workhorse of empirical international trade. It has shown to be extremely flexible and to be able to accommodate a number of very different research questions. That is why it's being used in many uh, very important papers and also in theses, master theses, and PhD theses. Border taxes. Border CO2 taxes are being introduced in several countries on their way to reduce CO2 emissions. So they, of course, want to fight leakages, and they don't want to import goods with high emissions in production. These taxes, of course, will have an impact on both developed and developing countries, and this impact will be very different in developing and in developed countries. And so it's very interesting to study the impact of these taxes. I mentioned before that the impact is very similar to a tariff. And as we also learned from the WTO, tariffs are there to be negotiated, and they're not there just to generate income for the government. This is something that in some countries still plays an important role, but generally it's very important to be able to negotiate with other countries a tariff reduction so that trade comes on stage, and this trade will generate potentially more tax income for the government than the tariff. Right? Finally, the pandemic has caused a very strong reduction of production and thus also an interruption of world trade. Recovery is expected to happen soon, and I think that we should learn from the current pandemic so that next time, when the next pandemic comes in, we are in a better position to face the challenge. So the scope for further research, I think I have already mentioned. We need much more research on the impact of border taxes and the impact of the pandemic on trade in developing countries. Climate change is, of course, a great challenge in the 21st century, and we need to discuss what the impact on developing countries is. The next pandemic is very likely going to happen sometime. By studying the current pandemic, we can prepare for the next challenge and maybe be able to avoid at least some of its worst effects. Thank you very much for your attention.